Hey everyone, welcome back to another video of mine, where today we're going to be solving Leetcode problem 884 titled Uncommon Words from Two Sentences. So a sentence is a string of single space separated words where each word consists of only lowercase letters. And a word is uncommon if it appears exactly once in one of the sentences and does not appear in the other sentence. So we're given two sentences S1 and S2, and we have to return a list of all of the uncommon words, which we can return our answer in any order. So this may seem a bit confusing at first when you really kind of just try to think about it in your head, and so let's actually visually depict this problem in the examples provided for this problem statement. So in example 1, we have an S1 sentence input string of "this apple is sweet," and as you can see, each word is basically separated by a space, one space to be exact. And so in sentence 2, or S2, we have "this apple is sour," and so we would output basically sweet and sour, an array of strings sweet and sour, because those are the only two elements that actually appear only once between both the input strings, right? The word sweet only appears once, and that was in S1. It doesn't appear in S2 at all. And of course, the word sour only appears once in S2, and it does not appear in S1 at all. So the key thing to note from here is that basically an answer or a string that we're ultimately going to be returning in our final array answer, it has to only appear in one of the input strings S1 or S2, and it can only have a frequency of 1. It can't have a frequency of 0 or 1 or more than 1. It has to have exactly a frequency of 1 and appear only in one of the input sentences strings. So if we apply that same logic to examples 2, we'd output banana, because banana is in sentence 2 with a frequency of 1, and it is not in sentence 1, because of course it isn't, right? And one key thing to note here is that we cannot return apple, because although apple is only in S1 and not in S2, apple actually has more than a frequency of 1. In fact, it has a frequency of 2, and so we can't actually output that or add it to our result array, which we will ultimately return. So like I said here, we ultimately want to initialize a resolution array, and of course it's going to be set to an empty array. Now, before we actually do that, one important thing to note from here is whenever we're working with the frequencies of different elements in iterables or strings, it's always important to actually grab the counter of these iterable, because the counter, what it essentially does is it literally just maps every single element that we see, every single unique element rather that we see within our input, and maps it with its frequency within that input or iterable, or basically the number of times that occurs within that input. So one thing to note is that we can't actually use the counter operations on strings just like this in Python, and so we actually have to convert it to an iterable like a list or an array. And to do that, we're going to be using the .split method, and we'll do this like so. We'll set the counter and store it basically in that variable count as the counter of S1 plus S2, but there is an issue here. We can't simply get the counter of the concatenation of two strings, but rather of the concatenation of two arrays. And so to actually convert these data structures or data types to arrays, we'll use the .split method, right? And for the parameter that we're going to pass in the .split method in Python is basically how you want to .split every single element in your input string. And so I'm going to pass in basically a quotation mark for both of these sentences. And essentially what this does is it simply separates every single element in our S1 and S2 and splits them apart from each other based on every single space within the input string, right? And it turns those elements that are separated by those spaces as different elements or characters in a list, right? So if we had, for example, "this apple is sweet," the split method basically looks for the parameter that we pass in, which in this case is basically just one space. And so every time it sees one space, it separates the two words between those two spaces and adds them separately as different elements in a string that it eventually converts that S1 to. And after we concatenate those two lists or iterables and grab the counter of it, we can actually store that in a count variable, right? After that, we simply want to loop through every single element and count and check if it has a frequency of 1. So we'll say, for I in the count, if count at that index I, or basically if count at that I, or basically I appears in that counter just exactly one time as defined by the problem statement, then great, we have found another valid character or valid element rather, that is uncommon, or basically only appears exactly once in one of the sentences. And so we'll add that to our resolution array. And it just occurred to me that I actually haven't added or initialized the array yet. So let me just do that outside of my for loop. I'll set res equal to an empty array. And after we've basically completed this iteration for every single element in the counter and checked if it actually has a frequency of 1 within our counter, we can simply ultimately return our resolution string, right? Unless I made any syntax errors here, this should be completely fine. And as you can see, it is just about as efficient you can get. It is basically linear or big O of n time for both runtime and memory complexity wise, because of course we have to get the counter, which is big O of n time of both of these strings. And we, of course, loop through the counter of them once, and so that's also going to be an O of n operation, or basically a linear time operation. So to kind of just recap about the code that we just did, we set the count basically equal to the counter of the list iterables of the concatenation of these two strings, with every single element being separated by an empty space, right, to kind of just differentiate where each word is separated. And then we initialize a resolution array that ultimately that we returned, which contained every single uncommon element or frequency element of 1 within that resolution string. We'll loop through every single element in the counter, and if that counter at that index I, or basically if that I in the counter actually had a frequency of exactly 1, as noted in the problem statement to meet the criteria, we would add it to our resolution string as another valid element. And once the iteration basically concluded for all the different elements, after we checked in this conditional if it actually met the criteria or basically had a frequency of 1, we simply returned our resolution string, which obviously will have contained every single valid element that fits that criteria. So if you guys enjoyed this video and liked this content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It really does mean a lot. And without further ado, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.